Hey everyone, I hope you had a safe and healthy spring break. I realize that the circumstances are really crazy right now, and I really hope all of you are doing okay. What I want to do briefly, and I don't know that I will be doing these for every single class, but I thought it would be helpful to at least give you some context for the readings that you have scheduled for this week on Charles Mills' The Racial Contract. um, I think it could sort of help you see how this reading fits into the larger context and progression that I had in mind for the course. Some of you will have already heard some of this that I went over in the Friday prior to spring break on March 13th, but a lot of you were absent from class that day. So I thought it might be helpful for you to just have a little bit of context. I'm going to be referencing the lecture notes for today's reading, which are pages 1 through 7, and you can find that on Canvas in the lecture notes folder. But let me just say something first about this reading in particular. So we have just finished we had just finished Crispin Sartwell's Against the State, and it largely hinged around the premise that the modern state is not based upon consent in any way, shape, or form, but that the modern state is fundamentally based upon coercion. And insofar as the modern state is based upon coercion, the modern state cannot be considered legitimate. Um, and in particular, this was taking aim at social contract theory because social contract theory is the one that premises justifying the state in terms of consent, in particular Locke's theory of social contract, of the social contract. Now, that was Sartwell. Now, the way that I sort of see us moving into the next set of readings is that we've seen that Sartwell thinks the state is based upon coercion. But we might ask, aren't there particular and more pernicious ways that the state engages in coercion? And one of the ways we might see that is through coercion on the basis of race, that the state engages in coercion on the basis of race. And so that is how this particular reading kind of fits into the trajectory that we had been kind of following prior to spring break, and that's how this particular set of readings fits into that. So Charles Mills' text titled The Racial Contract is Mill's way of trying to conceptualize what the actual historical social contract was. And so we've dealt in particular with Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau, sort of asking this question, well, was there ever a state of nature? Was there actually ever a moment of social contract where everybody came together? Did this describe a historical condition, or was this more just like a thought experiment? And so Mills, early on in the reading, makes a distinction between a descriptive and a normative account of the contract. And so the descriptive account, or in other words, a historical account, would purport to describe the actual historical conditions in which the contract was formed. And so that would purport to be a real historical account. And so it's not clear to what extent any of the thinkers we've read, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, intended their accounts of the state of nature and the social contract as a descriptive account. They seem to more have intended it as a normative account, which is to say, an account that we should be striving for, something that is kind of an ideal, that is kind of held in front of us as something that we should try to emulate in our own society and in our own conditions. Whereas Mills is clear that his account is meant to be an actual descriptive historical account, and he also describes it as a non-ideal account. Now, in particular, out of Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, one of them has also purported to describe a non-ideal account as opposed to an ideal account. So again, an ideal account is something that we would want to strive for, to emulate, whereas a non-ideal account would be one that seeks to expose the flaws within society, within the system, and is not something we'd want to emulate. But yet, the function of the non-ideal account is as a kind of critique. And so Mills is intending his account as both descriptive and non-ideal. But again, Mills is clear that the racial contract, as he sees it, is an actual historical account. In fact, Mills says his account of the social contract, what he calls the racial contract, is perhaps the most accurate description of what actually happened in the formation of Western states and societies. And indeed, the story Mills is telling is essentially one of Western imperialism, colonialism, and domination of the Americas, of Africa, and regions like that around the world. And so Mills takes himself to be giving a historical account of reality, which again is supposed to be non-ideal, which is to say we would not want to emulate or continue to emulate now or in the future the practices of colonialism any longer. So Mills, again, wants to provide this account and say that it is both non-ideal and descriptive. So let me just sort of briefly refer to the notes that I have here. Right. Mills writes, for example, in order to justify his project here, he writes, quote, and this is on page 3, "What is needed is a recognition that racism itself is a political system, a particular power structure or formal or informal rule, socioeconomic privilege, and norms for the differential distribution of material wealth and opportunities, benefits and burdens, rights and duties." So again, Mill is saying, with that quote and other things he says in today's reading, the racial contract was not a contract that was one between equals. The racial contract was inherently hierarchical, which is to say that the racial contract was one between white Europeans, and it intentionally excluded those who were non-white and non-European, in particular, Native Americans, Latin Americans, Africans, but it was meant to exclude all of them. So again, the racial contract was not one of inclusion, but one of exclusion. The racial contract described who was included, but it also described who was intentionally excluded. And so this is the account that Mills wants to give. So let me just say a bit more here about Mills, what Mills is saying, right? So again, what we just did, Mills talks about Rawls in today's reading. And I think that should give you some context because we just read Rawls. And indeed, he says that Rawls' account is an ideal normative account, which is to say it's ideal in the sense it's something that we should be striving towards. And it's normative in the sense that it prescribes how things ought to be, not how things actually are. So Mills is saying that by the 20th century with social contract theory, it was largely functioning in Rawls as the sort of primary proponent of social contract theory, that it is ideal and normative. Whereas Mills wants to say, but wait a second, my account is not ideal and it's not normative. It's not ideal in the sense we don't want to emulate it, and it's not normative in the sense that, and I'm not describing how things ought to be. It's not ideal because I'm describing how we don't want to continue doing things, and it is descriptive in the sense that I am describing a historical reality that happened throughout Western history over the past several centuries. So that key distinction between descriptive and normative and ideal and non-ideal is really crucial to understanding what Mills is up to here. So let me just take a look at the notes and see if there's anything here I want to talk about with you, right? So again, Mills says, too, that there was a similar work written by somebody named Carol Pateman called The Sexual Contract, which describes how the social contract was set up to exclude women. So he's basing his own racial contract on a similar work by a philosopher in the 20th century named Carol Pateman, titled The Sexual Contract. We're not reading that in this class, but it functions in the same way. It's a non-ideal, descriptive account of how the social contract intentionally excluded women and only included men. All right, and so Mills' goal here is to expose how the actual workings of the social contract. It's similar to Sartwell in that he wants to say, look, there's no sense in which the social contract was based upon consent. There's no sense in which that can possibly be true. It's based upon coercion. And again, the way that I see Mills fitting into that same picture that Sartwell was saying is, yes, the contract was not based on consent. It was based on coercion. It was based on exclusion, not inclusion. And indeed, the primary way that the contract was coercive and not based on consent is that it coerced on the basis of race. It said these people are included, those people are excluded. So that is the larger context for Mills' racial contract. Those are some of the key distinctions. And I may upload a video later in the week talking about some of the more distinctions, some of the further distinctions Mills makes, and talking about a moral, a political, and an epistemological contract within the racial contract itself. That shows up in Wednesday's readings. So that's all I have for now. I hope you take a look at this video, and I hope it's helpful in understanding what's going on within Mills' writing for today's reading. Thank you, and again, be safe and be healthy.